October 1965, Los Angeles, California. The Starlight Diner on Sunset Boulevard sat nearly empty at 3 in the morning, its neon sign flickering against a sky that was just beginning to show the first hints of the gray that would eventually become dawn. Inside, a 29-year-old waitress named Dorothy Jean Mitchell wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her movements automatic after 6 years of working the graveyard shift that nobody else wanted, but that she had claimed as her own because it allowed her to care for her daughter during the day when the child needed her most. The only customer had left 20 minutes earlier, a truck driver who had tipped generously and complimented her coffee in the way that lonely travelers often did when they encountered kindness in the anonymous spaces between destinations. Dorothy had pocketed the tip with gratitude, knowing that every dollar brought her closer to the rent payment that was due in 5 days, and that always seemed to arrive before she was ready. The cook had retreated to the back room for a cigarette break that would probably last until the next customer arrived, leaving Dorothy alone in the dining room with only the hum of the refrigeration unit and the occasional sound of cars passing on Sunset Boulevard to keep her company. She checked the clock above the pie case and calculated that she had at least 4 more hours before the morning shift arrived to relieve her. It was in moments like these, when the diner was empty and the world seemed to have forgotten that she existed, that Dorothy allowed herself to sing. The habit had started years earlier, a way of passing the long hours when the silence became oppressive and the loneliness of the graveyard shift threatened to overwhelm her spirit. She had learned to love these stolen moments when no one could hear her and no one could judge whether her voice was good enough to deserve an audience. She began with a hymn her mother had taught her, a song about grace and redemption that had carried her through difficult times, when faith seemed like the only thing standing between her and complete despair. Her voice rose in the empty diner, filling the space with a sound that transformed the utilitarian restaurant into something approaching a cathedral, sacred and set apart from the ordinary world outside. The acoustics of the diner were surprisingly good, the tile floors and metal surfaces reflecting her voice in ways that added depth and resonance to notes that might have sounded thin in other environments. Dorothy had discovered this accidentally years earlier and had since used the diner as her private concert hall, a stage where she could perform for an audience of empty booths and ketchup bottles without fear of criticism or rejection. She moved from the hymn to a ballad, a love song she had heard on the radio that afternoon and that had been playing in her mind ever since. The lyrics spoke of longing and loss in ways that resonated with her own experience of a marriage that had ended badly, and a husband who had disappeared leaving nothing but debts, and a daughter who asked questions Dorothy could not answer. What Dorothy did not know was that the diner was not as empty as she believed. A man sat in the back booth, hidden in the shadows cast by the angle of the overhead lights, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he listened to her voice, with an attention that had been absent from his face when he first slipped in through the side door 30 minutes earlier. Frank Sinatra had been unable to sleep again, too, driven from his bed by the insomnia that had plagued him since childhood, and that seemed to grow worse with each passing year, as the pressures of his career and his complicated personal life accumulated like weight on shoulders that were growing tired of carrying burdens that never seemed to lighten. He had come to the Starlight Diner seeking anonymity, choosing a location far enough from the glamorous establishments where he was known to guarantee that he would not be recognized or disturbed. He wore no hat, no sunglasses, nothing that might draw attention to a face that was famous enough to cause commotion in most public spaces, but that might pass unnoticed in a diner where the graveyard shift waitress had other things on her mind. The coffee he had ordered was merely a prop, an excuse to occupy a booth while he sat with his thoughts in a space where no one expected anything from him. He had been staring at the pattern of the Formica tabletop, lost in contemplation of problems that had no solutions, when the waitress had begun to sing and everything had changed. The voice that filled the diner was not what Sinatra had expected from a waitress working the graveyard shift at a roadside restaurant, not the amateur warbling that he might have dismissed with polite disinterest if forced to acknowledge it. This was something else entirely, a voice of remarkable purity and emotional depth that demanded attention regardless of the listener's mood or preoccupations. He sat frozen in the back booth, afraid to move or make any sound that might alert her to his presence and cause her to stop singing. The song she was performing was one he knew well, having recorded his own version years earlier, but her interpretation brought dimensions to the lyrics that his arrangement had not explored, a feminine vulnerability that transformed the meaning of words he had thought he understood completely. Dorothy finished the ballad and paused for a moment, her eyes closed as she savored the last notes fading into the silence of the empty diner. Then she began another song, this one more up-tempo, a jazz standard that allowed her to demonstrate technical abilities that Sinatra recognized immediately as the product of either extensive training or extraordinary natural talent, possibly both. Her phrasing was sophisticated, her breath control impeccable, her emotional connection to the material genuine in ways that many professional singers never achieved, despite years of coaching and performance experience. Sinatra found himself leaning forward in the booth, drawn toward the source of the sound like a moth toward a flame that promised illumination rather than destruction. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in the Starlight Diner at 3 in the morning in October 1965 involves one of the most remarkable discoveries in music history, a waitress who thought she was singing alone, and the legendary entertainer who heard something in her voice that convinced him she deserved an audience far larger than empty booths and ketchup bottles. By the end of this story, you will understand why Frank Sinatra believed that talent could be found in the most unexpected places, and why he spent his life trying to give opportunities to those who might otherwise never be heard. Dorothy Jean Mitchell had been born on April 3, 1936, in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, a small town on the Tennessee River that would later become famous as a center of American music recording, but that in her childhood was simply another poor Southern community, where opportunities for black families were limited by laws and customs designed to keep them in their place. Her father worked at the local fertilizer plant, her mother took in laundry from white families, and music was the one luxury they could afford because it cost nothing except the breath required to produce it. The church where Dorothy's family worshipped every Sunday was the first stage she ever knew, a wooden building with hard pews and a piano that was always slightly out of tune, but that provided accompaniment for voices that needed no mechanical assistance to reach the rafters and beyond. She sang in the children's choir from the age of 4, her voice already distinguishable from the others by a quality that the choir director described as touched by something holy. By the time she was 12, Dorothy was singing solos during services, her voice carrying through the open windows of the church to draw listeners from the street who stopped whatever they were doing to hear the girl whose gift seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. The congregation took pride in her talent, seeing it as evidence that God had blessed their community with something special, despite all the hardships they endured. The dream of a music career had flickered briefly during her teenage years, fueled by stories of black singers who had broken through the barriers of segregation to achieve fame and fortune in the wider world. But dreams required resources that her family did not possess. And by the time Dorothy graduated from high school, the practical demands of survival had extinguished any hope that she might follow the path that her talent seemed to deserve. She married young, at 19, to a man named Curtis, who promised her a better life in California where jobs were plentiful, and the racism was supposedly less oppressive than in Alabama. They loaded everything they owned into a used car and drove west, arriving in Los Angeles with $50 and a faith in the future that would prove to be misplaced. Curtis found work at a factory that manufactured aircraft parts, earning enough to support them in a small apartment in a neighborhood where black families were tolerated if not welcomed. Dorothy worked as a maid for white families in the hills, cleaning houses that seemed impossibly large compared to anything she had known in Muscle Shoals, returning home exhausted to prepare meals for a husband who grew more distant with each passing month. The daughter arrived in 1960, a girl they named Sarah, after Dorothy's mother, who had died the previous year without ever meeting her grandchild. The birth was difficult, the recovery slow, and by the time Dorothy was strong enough to return to work, Curtis had found another woman and another life that did not include the responsibilities of fatherhood. The divorce was quick and uncontested, Curtis disappearing into the vastness of Los Angeles with whatever money they had managed to save during their years together. Dorothy was left alone with an infant daughter, no job, and no family within 2,000 miles who might have helped her survive the crisis that threatened to destroy everything. The job at the Starlight Diner came through a friend from church who knew the owner and who vouched for Dorothy's character, despite her lack of restaurant experience. The graveyard shift was available because no one else wanted it, the hours brutal for anyone with a normal life but perfect for a single mother who needed to be available during the day when her daughter required care. Dorothy learned the job quickly, discovering that she had a talent for the work that surprised her, given her lack of background in food service. Customers liked her warmth, her efficiency, her ability to remember their orders and their names, and the small details of their lives that they shared during the intimate conversations that seemed to happen naturally in diners at 3 in the morning. The singing had started as a way to fill the silence during the long hours when no customers came, and the loneliness of the empty diner pressed against her like a physical weight. She had been embarrassed at first, afraid that the cook might hear and think her foolish for performing to an audience of empty booths. But the cook never commented, and gradually Dorothy had claimed the space as her own private stage. 5 years into the job, singing alone in the empty diner had become as natural as breathing, a nightly ritual that sustained her spirit through the difficulties of a life that offered few other pleasures. She never thought about whether she was good enough to sing for a real audience. The question seemed irrelevant to someone whose dreams of a music career had died so long ago that she barely remembered what it had felt like to hope. Frank Sinatra sat in the back booth for nearly an hour, listening to Dorothy work through a repertoire that demonstrated the breadth of her musical knowledge and the depth of her emotional range. She sang standards and spirituals, pop songs and blues, each one delivered with a commitment that suggested she was not merely passing time, but engaging in something that mattered to her soul. When she finally paused to refill sugar dispensers, Sinatra made his move, rising from the booth and walking toward the counter where she stood with her back to him, unaware that her audience of one was about to reveal himself. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her but needing to make his presence known before he could say what he had come to the counter to say. Dorothy turned and found herself face to face with a man she recognized immediately, a face that had appeared on album covers and movie screens and magazine covers throughout her entire adult life. The sugar dispenser slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, scattering white crystals across the tile in a pattern that neither of them noticed because their eyes were locked in a moment of mutual recognition that transcended the ordinary. Sinatra spoke first, apologizing for startling her and for listening without her knowledge, explaining that he had been sitting in the back booth when she began to sing, and that he had not wanted to interrupt something so beautiful by revealing his presence. His voice was gentle, respectful, utterly different from the demanding tone that his reputation might have suggested. Dorothy stood frozen, unable to process the reality of what was happening, the collision between her mundane world of coffee refills and tip calculations, and the extraordinary world of a legend who was somehow standing in the Starlight Diner at 3:30 in the morning, telling her that her singing was beautiful. She managed to stammer something about making a mess with the sugar, reaching for a broom to clean up the scattered crystals as a way of doing something, anything, that might restore her sense of reality in a moment that felt like a dream, from which she would surely wake at any moment. Sinatra stopped her, saying that the sugar could wait, that he wanted to talk to her about her voice, and where she had learned to sing, and why she was working the graveyard shift at a diner when she should be performing on stages where her talent could be appreciated by audiences who deserved to hear what she had to offer. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, interrupted only by the occasional customer who required service and who stared at the famous man sitting at the counter without quite believing their own eyes. Sinatra bought coffee after coffee, asking questions about Dorothy's life, her training, her dreams, her reasons for believing that a music career was impossible for someone in her circumstances. He listened with the attention of someone who understood that talent was distributed without regard to economics or opportunity, that the greatest voices often belong to people who would never be heard because the systems designed to identify and nurture talent were biased toward those who already had advantages. Dorothy's story confirmed everything he believed about the waste of human potential that occurred daily in a society that measured worth by wealth rather than ability. By the time the morning shift arrived, Sinatra had made Dorothy an offer that would change her life forever. He would arrange for her to audition for producers at Reprise Records, the label he had founded years earlier, and that still respected his judgment on matters of talent. He would personally vouch for her abilities and ensure that she received a fair hearing from people who had the power to launch careers. Dorothy protested that she could not possibly accept such generosity from a stranger, that she had responsibilities to her daughter that prevented her from pursuing dreams that had died years ago, that she was too old at 29 to begin a career in an industry that favored youth. Each objection was met by Sinatra with patient counterarguments drawn from his own experience and his knowledge of how the music business actually worked. He told her about artists who had achieved success at ages far older than 29, about the ways that life experience could enhance rather than diminish the emotional authenticity that audiences craved, about the arrangements that could be made to accommodate a single mother's responsibilities while still pursuing professional opportunities. The audition took place 2 weeks later, arranged through Sinatra's personal intervention with executives who would not have given a graveyard shift waitress the time of day without his endorsement. Dorothy performed 3 songs for a room full of men in suits who controlled access to the recording industry, her voice filling the space with the same power that had stopped Sinatra in his tracks at the Starlight Diner. The contract offer came the following day, modest by industry standards but life-changing for a woman who had been earning minimum wage plus tips just weeks earlier. Dorothy signed with trembling hands, still not quite believing that the dream she had abandoned was somehow being resurrected by a chance encounter with a man who happened to be unable to sleep. Her debut album was recorded over 3 months in late 1965 and early 1966, produced by veterans who recognized her talent and worked to capture on vinyl what made her voice special. Sinatra visited the sessions occasionally, offering suggestions with the authority of someone who had recorded more albums than most artists would record in several lifetimes. The album was released in the spring of 1966 to reviews that praised Dorothy's emotional authenticity and questioned why she had not been discovered years earlier. Sales were modest but steady, building an audience through radio play and word of mouth among listeners who appreciated the depth of feeling that distinguished her work from the manufactured pop that dominated the charts. Dorothy's career never reached the heights that Sinatra's had, but it provided her with opportunities and income that transformed her circumstances and those of her daughter Sarah. She recorded 7 albums over the following 15 years, toured nationally, and built a following among audiences who valued the qualities that Sinatra had recognized in the empty diner at 3 in the morning. The Starlight Diner where they met remained a touchstone for both of them, a location that Sinatra visited occasionally in the years that followed, always sitting in the back booth and always ordering coffee he barely touched. The staff came to recognize him, but they protected his privacy because Dorothy had asked them to, understanding that the man needed a place where he could be anonymous even as his fame made anonymity increasingly impossible. Sarah grew up knowing Frank Sinatra as her mother's friend and benefactor, a relationship that seemed perfectly normal to her until she was old enough to understand the magnitude of his fame and the improbability of their connection. She learned the story of the night at the Starlight Diner gradually, understanding more deeply with each retelling the chain of events that had led from her mother's singing to the life they now enjoyed. Dorothy and Sinatra maintained their friendship for over 3 decades, a bond based not on business or celebrity, but on the shared understanding that had passed between them when he first revealed himself at the counter of the Starlight Diner. She attended his birthday celebrations, visited his homes, and was welcomed into an inner circle that included few people who had known Sinatra before he became the legend that the world worshipped. The insomnia that had driven Sinatra to the diner that night continued to plague him throughout his life, but he came to see it as a gift rather than a curse because it had led him to discover Dorothy and her extraordinary voice. He told the story often in later years, using it as evidence that talent existed everywhere, and that those with power had a responsibility to seek it out rather than waiting for it to arrive at their doorstep through conventional channels. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, and Dorothy was among those who received private notification before the news became public. She flew to Los Angeles for the funeral, sitting with family and close friends who understood that her presence was not merely honorary, but reflected a genuine relationship that had enriched both their lives in ways that outsiders could not fully comprehend. The Starlight Diner closed in 2003, a casualty of changing demographics and rising rents that made the old business model unsustainable. Dorothy attended the closing ceremony, standing in the space where she had once sung alone at 3 in the morning, remembering the night when Frank Sinatra had emerged from the shadows of the back booth and changed everything with his willingness to listen. She told the story of that night countless times over the years, using it to encourage other aspiring artists who doubted whether their talents would ever be recognized. The message was always the same, that you never knew who might be listening, that opportunities could arrive from the most unexpected directions, and that the voice inside you deserved to be heard regardless of whether anyone seemed to be paying attention. Dorothy Jean Mitchell died on February 18, 2019 at the age of 82, surrounded by her daughter Sarah and grandchildren, who carried forward the legacy of perseverance and faith that she had demonstrated throughout her remarkable life. Her obituary mentioned her recording career, her connection to Frank Sinatra, and her years as a waitress at the Starlight Diner where everything had begun. The back booth where Sinatra sat that night was salvaged when the diner was demolished. Preserved by a collector who understood its historical significance, it now resides in a music museum in Nashville, displayed alongside the story of what happened when a waitress sang to an empty diner at 3 in the morning, and the greatest voice of the 20th century happened to be listening from the shadows. Sarah continued her mother's legacy after Dorothy's death, establishing a foundation in her name that provides scholarships to aspiring musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds who might otherwise never have the opportunity to develop their talents. The foundation's motto is drawn from Dorothy's favorite saying about the night at the Starlight Diner, that you never know who might be listening. The recordings Dorothy made during her career have been reissued multiple times over the decades, finding new audiences among listeners who appreciate the emotional authenticity that distinguished her work from the more polished productions of her contemporaries. Critics have noted that her voice carries a quality that cannot be manufactured, a depth of feeling that comes only from lived experience. Sinatra's role in discovering Dorothy became part of the broader narrative about his complicated legacy, evidence that the man famous for his demanding nature and explosive temper was also capable of extraordinary patience and generosity toward those whose talent he recognized and respected. The music industry that Dorothy navigated during her career has changed dramatically since the night she sang alone in the Starlight Diner, transformed by technologies and business models that Sinatra could not have imagined during his lifetime. But the fundamental challenge of discovering talent in unexpected places remains constant. Documentary filmmakers have produced several projects about Dorothy's story, each attempting to capture the improbability of what occurred and the decades-long friendship that developed between a graveyard shift waitress and the most famous entertainer in America. The church in Muscle Shoals where Dorothy first learned to sing still stands, now designated as a historic site that commemorates the community's contribution to American music. Visitors learn about Dorothy's story as part of the larger narrative about the town's musical heritage. Her daughter Sarah gave birth to 3 children who grew up knowing the story of their grandmother's discovery as a family legend that connected them to entertainment history. The grandchildren have inherited Dorothy's musical talents, though none has pursued professional careers. The graveyard shift at diners across America continues to attract workers who need flexibility in their schedules, single parents and students and artists who work through the night while the rest of the world sleeps. Some of them sing to themselves in empty dining rooms, never knowing whether anyone might be listening from a back booth. Sinatra's insomnia, which had driven him to the Starlight Diner that October night, continued to plague him throughout his later years. But he never complained about it after meeting Dorothy, recognizing that his sleeplessness had led him to one of the most meaningful discoveries of his life. The coffee that Sinatra barely touched that night became a running joke between them in later years. Dorothy teasing him about being her worst customer ever because he had occupied a booth for hours while spending less than $1. Sinatra always laughed and responded that the entertainment had been worth far more than any tip he could have left. The recording sessions for Dorothy's debut album were documented by photographers who captured images that now hang in several music museums, showing a black woman from Alabama standing at a microphone in a Los Angeles studio, surrounded by the best musicians and engineers that Sinatra's influence could assemble. The album's critical success opened doors for other artists who might otherwise have been overlooked by an industry that often valued commercial potential over artistic merit. Dorothy became known as someone who had benefited from Sinatra's mentorship and who was willing to pay that forward by supporting younger artists. Her concert performances developed a devoted following among audiences who appreciated the intimacy of her style and the emotional honesty of her interpretations. Critics noted that she never seemed to be merely performing, but rather sharing something genuine with everyone present. The relationship between Dorothy and Sinatra remained professional in its boundaries, but deeply personal in its warmth, a connection based on mutual respect for each other's talent and gratitude for the chance encounter that had brought them together. Neither ever forgot the moment when their eyes met across the counter of the Starlight Diner. Barbara Sinatra, Frank's fourth wife, understood that Dorothy occupied a unique position in her husband's life, someone whose presence predated their marriage and whose claim on his loyalty was based on something more profound than mere friendship. She welcomed Dorothy to their home and events without jealousy or resentment. The sugar dispenser that Dorothy dropped when she first saw Sinatra standing behind her was never replaced, its absence a silent memorial to the moment when everything changed. The owner of the Starlight Diner kept the spot empty on the counter as a conversation piece for customers who asked about the stain that sugar had left on the tile. The story of the Starlight Diner has been told and retold so many times that some details have undoubtedly been embellished or altered in the telling. But the essential truth remains unchanged, that a woman sang alone in an empty diner at 3 a.m, and Frank Sinatra was in the back booth. And what happened next proved that destiny sometimes arranges meetings between people whose lives are meant to intersect. The neon sign from the Starlight Diner was preserved after the building's demolition, donated to the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles, where it hangs above an exhibit dedicated to Dorothy's story and Sinatra's role in her discovery. Visitors often pause before it, imagining the glow that once illuminated a stretch of Sunset Boulevard, where a miracle occurred in the silence between the departure of one customer and the arrival of dawn. The morning after Sinatra revealed himself at the Starlight Diner, Dorothy arrived home to find her daughter Sarah already awake and asking why her mother looked different than she had when she left for work the previous evening. Dorothy struggled to explain what had happened, knowing that the story would sound like a fantasy invented by someone who had spent too many hours alone in an empty restaurant. She called her friend from church, the one who had helped her get the job at the diner, and recounted the events of the night in a voice that trembled with disbelief at her own words. Her friend listened in silence, then asked Dorothy if she was certain she had not fallen asleep, and dreamed the entire encounter with the most famous singer in America. The business card Sinatra had given her before leaving the diner was the only physical evidence that the conversation had actually occurred. Dorothy studied it throughout that day, running her fingers over the embossed letters that spelled out a name she had known since childhood, wondering if she had the courage to use the phone number written on the back. 3 days passed before she made the call, days spent in agonizing uncertainty about whether the offer had been genuine, or merely the kind of empty promise that famous people made to ordinary folks they encountered briefly and then forgot. When Sinatra's assistant answered and confirmed that Mr. Sinatra was expecting her call, Dorothy nearly dropped the phone. The audition was scheduled for the following week, giving Dorothy time to prepare, but also time to worry about everything that could go wrong when she stood before people who had the power to make or destroy careers with a single decision. She practiced in her apartment after Sarah went to sleep, singing the songs she would perform with an intensity that made her neighbors wonder what was happening. Her friend from church helped her find something appropriate to wear, a simple dress that looked professional without trying too hard to impress people who had seen everything the fashion world had to offer. Dorothy stood before the mirror on the morning of the audition, seeing a woman she barely recognized staring back at her with eyes that held equal measures of hope and terror. The Reprise Records office was located in a building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who did not belong in the world of entertainment industry power. Dorothy walked through the lobby, feeling as if everyone was staring at her, knowing that a black woman in a borrowed dress did not fit the profile of artists who normally pass through these doors on their way to recording contracts. The executives who gathered to hear her audition were polite but skeptical, their expressions suggesting that they were present as a favor to Sinatra rather than from any genuine expectation that a graveyard shift waitress might possess talent worth their professional attention. Dorothy could feel their doubt pressing against her as she took her position before the microphone. She closed her eyes and imagined herself back in the Starlight Diner, alone in the empty room where her voice had always felt safe and free. The first notes emerged tentatively, but by the second phrase, she had found the confidence that came from years of singing to herself in the small hours of the morning when only the coffee cups were listening. The song she chose was a ballad that Sinatra himself had recorded years earlier, a risk that could have seemed presumptuous, but that Dorothy knew would demonstrate her ability to interpret material that sophisticated audiences expected. Her version was different from his, shaped by her own experience and her own emotional connection to lyrics about loss and longing. When she finished, the room was silent in a way that could have meant either complete rejection or something else entirely. Dorothy kept her eyes closed, afraid to look at the faces that would tell her whether her dreams had been resurrected or finally killed by exposure to professional judgment that would not spare her feelings. Then she heard applause, not the polite acknowledgement that executives might offer out of courtesy to a Sinatra protégé, but genuine enthusiasm that built as the men in suits rose from their chairs and approached her with expressions that had transformed completely from the skepticism she had sensed when she first entered the room. The contract negotiation began that afternoon, conducted by an attorney that Sinatra's office had recommended to ensure that Dorothy was not exploited by an industry that routinely took advantage of artists who lacked experience with the business side of music. The terms were more favorable than she had dared to hope. Dorothy called Sinatra that evening to thank him, her voice breaking with emotion as she tried to express gratitude that seemed impossible to put into words. He deflected her thanks with characteristic gruffness, saying only that she should focus on making the album that would prove to everyone what he had already known since hearing her sing in the empty diner. The recording sessions began in January 1966, a process that challenged Dorothy in ways that her years of singing alone had not prepared her for. The studio environment was technical and demanding, requiring her to deliver performances that could be captured on tape rather than simply experienced in the moment. The producer assigned to her album was patient but exacting, pushing her to find new depths in songs she thought she already understood completely. There were moments of frustration when Dorothy wondered if she had made a mistake by leaving the safety of the Starlight Diner for a world that seemed determined to prove she did not belong. But there were also moments of breakthrough, recordings that captured something magical on the first take, and that made everyone in the control room stop what they were doing to listen with the attention that great art commands. Dorothy began to believe that she might actually belong in this world after all. Sinatra visited the studio twice during the recording process, appearing without announcement and sitting quietly in the back of the control room as he had sat in the back booth of the Starlight Diner. His presence was both encouraging and terrifying, a reminder of the expectations that his endorsement had created and the consequences of failing to meet them. The album was completed in March 1966, 12 songs that represented Dorothy's transformation from a waitress who sang alone in an empty diner to a recording artist whose work would be heard by audiences across the country. She held the finished vinyl in her hands and wept, understanding finally that the dream she had abandoned years ago had somehow found its way back to her. Sarah, now 6 years old, did not fully understand why her mother was crying while holding a record with her own picture on the cover. But she understood that something important had happened, something that would change their lives in ways that neither of them could fully anticipate as they sat together in their small apartment, listening to the playback of songs that had been born in the silence of the Starlight Diner at 3 in the morning when the world was asleep and anything seemed possible. The album's release in the spring of 1966 was accompanied by a publicity campaign that emphasized Dorothy's remarkable story, the discovery by Frank Sinatra at 3 in the morning in a diner where she thought she was singing alone. Journalists who interviewed her found a woman whose humility and grace contradicted the egotism that often characterized performers who had achieved far less than she was now achieving. The first radio station to play Dorothy's debut single was a small station in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, her hometown where she had first learned to sing in the church where her mother had led the choir. The disc jockey who introduced the song spoke about the local girl who had gone to California and been discovered by Frank Sinatra, a story that seemed to confirm everything the community believed about the power of talent and faith. Dorothy's mother, who had moved to Los Angeles to help care for Sarah, heard the radio broadcast through a phone call from a cousin who still lived in Muscle Shoals. She wept as she listened to her daughter's voice emerging from a radio speaker 2,000 miles away, proof that the gift she had recognized in Dorothy's childhood had finally found the audience it deserved. The concert tour that followed the album's release took Dorothy to cities she had only read about in magazines during her years working the graveyard shift. She performed in Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia, building an audience through the intimate connection that her voice created with listeners who felt that she was singing directly to them, regardless of how many people filled the venue. Sinatra attended the Chicago concert, flying in specifically to witness Dorothy's first performance in a major venue outside Los Angeles. He sat in the audience rather than backstage, wanting to experience her show as an ordinary listener and to assess how she was developing as a live performer without the pressure of his visible presence. The performance exceeded his expectations, Dorothy commanding the stage with a confidence that had been absent during her nervous early appearances. She had learned to connect with audiences, to use the intimacy of her voice to create bonds that transcended the physical distance between performer and listener. After the show, Sinatra visited her dressing room with a bottle of champagne and words of congratulation that meant more to Dorothy than any review or sales figure could have meant. He told her that she had become a real performer, not just a singer, but an artist who understood how to create experiences that audiences would remember long after the music ended. The relationship between them deepened during the following years as Dorothy's career developed and she proved worthy of the investment Sinatra had made in her potential. They spoke regularly by telephone, conversations that ranged from professional advice to personal confidences that neither shared with anyone else. Dorothy learned about Sinatra's insecurities, his fears of losing his voice, and his relevance in an industry that constantly demanded reinvention. He learned about her struggles with guilt over leaving Sarah for tours, her uncertainty about how to balance the career she had finally achieved with the motherhood she refused to abandon. The second album, released in 1968, showed significant artistic growth that critics attributed to Dorothy's increased confidence and her willingness to take risks that her debut had avoided. The songs were more emotionally complex, the arrangements more sophisticated, the overall impact more powerful than anything she had previously recorded. Sales improved substantially with the second album, reaching audiences who had missed her debut and who discovered her through radio play that increased as stations recognized the quality of her work. The modest success of her first album was transforming into something more substantial that suggested a long career was possible if she continued to develop. Sarah was now 8 years old and increasingly aware that her mother was famous in ways that other children's mothers were not. She brought Dorothy's album to school for show and tell, proud to share evidence that her mother was the woman whose voice emerged from radios and whose picture appeared in magazines that adults read. The complexities of raising a child while maintaining a career were constant challenges that Dorothy navigated with the help of her mother and the understanding of producers and managers who recognized that her family obligations were non-negotiable regardless of professional opportunities that might conflict with them. Sinatra admired her commitment to Sarah, recognizing in it a dedication that he had not always shown to his own children during the years when his career had consumed everything else in his life. He sometimes reflected on the choices he had made and wondered whether Dorothy's balance was something he could have achieved if he had prioritized differently. The third album came in 1970, a departure from her previous work that incorporated elements of the soul music that was dominating the charts, and that Dorothy's voice was naturally suited to interpret. The risk paid off commercially, generating her first significant hit single that reached audiences far beyond the niche that had discovered her earlier work. The success brought new pressures that Dorothy had not anticipated, demands on her time and attention that threatened to overwhelm the careful balance she had constructed between career and family. She called Sinatra late one night, exhausted and uncertain, seeking advice from someone who had navigated similar pressures decades earlier. He listened without interrupting as she described the chaos that success was creating in her life, the constant travel, the business decisions, the people who suddenly wanted pieces of her time and energy that she did not have to spare. When she finished, he offered perspective that only someone with his experience could provide. He told her that success was a problem that solved itself if she remembered why she had wanted it in the first place. The music was the point, not the fame or the money or the demands that came with them. If she kept the music at the center of everything, the rest would arrange itself around that priority in ways that would preserve what mattered most. The advice became a touchstone that Dorothy returned to throughout the following decades, whenever success threatened to become a burden rather than a blessing. She learned to say no to demands that conflicted with her priorities, to protect the time she needed for Sarah, and for the creative work that had brought her to Sinatra's attention in the first place. The 1970s brought changes to the music industry that challenged artists of Dorothy's generation, forcing them to adapt or fade into obscurity as new styles and new technologies transformed how music was created and consumed. Dorothy navigated these changes with the guidance of advisors who understood that her authenticity was her greatest asset. Her live performances became the foundation of her career during this period, concert appearances that allowed her to connect with audiences in ways that recordings could not fully capture. Fans who saw her perform live often described the experience as transformative, as if she was singing directly to each person individually, despite the size of the venue. The relationship with Sinatra deepened during these years, as both artists confronted the challenges of aging in an industry that worshipped youth and novelty. They spoke by phone regularly, conversations that ranged from business advice to personal reflections on lives that had intersected so improbably that October night in the Starlight Diner. Dorothy's fourth album, released in 1973, was dedicated to Sinatra, in acknowledgement of everything he had done for her career and her life. The dedication read simply, "For Frank, who heard me when I thought I was singing alone." He kept a copy of that album in his home until his death, displayed prominently among the countless awards and memorabilia that documented his legendary career. Sarah graduated from high school in 1978, a young woman who had grown up watching her mother balance fame and family in ways that many celebrity parents failed to achieve. She chose to attend college in Los Angeles, wanting to remain close to Dorothy, even as she pursued her own path toward independence and adulthood. The decision to reduce her touring schedule came in the early 1980s, to recognition that Dorothy wanted to be present for the milestones of Sarah's life, rather than experiencing them through phone calls from distant cities. The choice cost her commercially, but enriched her personally in ways that she never regretted, despite the opportunities it closed. Sinatra understood her decision better than most, having himself struggled with the tension between career and family throughout his life. He told her that she was making the right choice, that the music would always be there, but that the moments with her daughter would not wait for her to finish one more tour or record one more album. Dorothy's fifth and sixth albums were recorded in Los Angeles, allowing her to return home each night to Sarah rather than spending months in distant studios. The productions were more modest than her earlier work, but retained the emotional authenticity that had always been her signature quality. The critics who had championed her debut continued to praise her subsequent releases, noting that her voice had gained depth and complexity as she aged, while losing none of the raw emotional power that had first caught Sinatra's attention. One reviewer wrote that listening to Dorothy was like watching a master painter continue to develop their craft across decades of work. Sarah married in 1985, a ceremony at which Dorothy sang a song she had written specifically for the occasion. Sinatra attended as an honored guest, his presence causing a stir among the other attendees, who had not expected the most famous entertainer in America to appear at a wedding in a modest Los Angeles church. The grandchildren arrived in the following years, 3 in total, each one bringing new joy to Dorothy's life and new reasons to be grateful for the balance she had maintained between career and family. She sang lullabies to them, the way her grandmother had sung to her in Muscle Shoals, passing down melodies that connected generations across the distance of decades and miles. Sinatra's health began to decline in the late 1980s, a gradual diminishment that those who loved him watched with the helplessness that accompanies the aging of parents and mentors who once seemed invincible. Dorothy visited him when she could, conversations that sometimes wandered as his memory failed, but that always returned to music when prompted. She sang for him during one of those visits, performing in his living room the same songs she had sung in the empty Starlight Diner decades earlier. His eyes closed as he listened, and for a moment he seemed to be back in that back booth, hearing her for the first time, recognizing the gift that would connect their lives forever. The final concert Dorothy gave was in 1995, a farewell performance in Los Angeles that drew fans from across the country who wanted to witness the end of a career that had begun so improbably in an empty diner at 3 in the morning. Sinatra was too ill to attend, but he sent a message that was read from the stage, expressing pride in everything she had accomplished and gratitude for the night that had brought them together. She retired from performing after that concert, but continued to teach, working with young singers who reminded her of herself when she was struggling to believe that her voice deserved to be heard. The lessons she offered combined technical instruction with the wisdom she had accumulated across 3 decades of professional work. The foundation she established in Sinatra's memory after his death focused on discovering talent in unexpected places, funding talent scouts who visited small clubs and churches and, yes, diners, searching for voices that might otherwise never reach audiences who deserved to hear them. The Foundation's work continues today. Dorothy's legacy multiplied through the careers of artists she helped launch. Her own story became part of the curriculum she taught, evidence that the path to success was rarely straight, and that the most important breaks often came from sources that could not have been predicted or planned. She emphasized that every performance mattered, that you never knew who might be listening, that the song you sang alone at 3 in the morning might be the one that changed your life. The grandchildren who gathered around Dorothy in her final years knew the story of the Starlight Diner as intimately as they knew their own birthdays, a family legend that connected them to a history larger than themselves. They understood that they existed in part because Frank Sinatra could not sleep one October night and chose to seek anonymity in a diner on Sunset Boulevard. Dorothy Jean Mitchell took her final breath on February 18, 2019, surrounded by 3 generations of family who carried forward the legacy of faith and perseverance that she had demonstrated throughout her remarkable life. The last song she sang was the same hymn she had been singing in the Starlight Diner when Frank Sinatra first heard her voice, a melody about grace that had carried her from Alabama to Los Angeles and beyond. Rest in peace, Dorothy Jean Mitchell. Your voice deserved to be heard, and thanks to one man's insomnia and his willingness to listen from a back booth at 3 in the morning, it was heard by audiences who never knew how close they came to never experiencing your gift. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that defined an era also recognized another voice that October night, hearing something in a Waitress's song that convinced you she deserved a stage far larger than an empty diner. What you did with that recognition changed a life and proved that talent can be found anywhere, if only someone powerful enough cares to look.